Okay, thanks.
Ready to start when you are.
Yeah, okay, yeah, just wait till 12:30 by the Microsoft clock.
Brilliant.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest in our webinar series. So I'll just put my camera on. Hi Kathy, good, I can see you too. Hi.
Hello.
Our aim is to help researchers and practitioners share knowledge and experience in natural flood management. And today we're really pleased to have Kathy Bauer from the South East Rivers Trust. And she's going to talk about monitoring infiltration and retention to support assessment of ecosystem services. Just before I hand over to Kathy, I can't see the slides to move. Slides. Thank you. Just before I hand over to Kathy, a couple of housekeeping points. So your microphone should be muted when you join and video's off. So please keep them off to avoid distracting the webinar. Please do though ask questions. Use the chat function and make comments and respond to other people's comments. We've had some quite lively discussions in previous webinars, so yeah, really do encourage that. There will be 15 minutes or so at the end of the webinar for questions, so I'll go through those that people have submitted on the chat, plus some that people have submitted beforehand. I need to let you know the webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available on our website in the next few days. Just a little bit of background on the research programme itself. So it's a NERC-funded 4-year programme. It's worth around £4 million. And we're carrying out novel science to improve the understanding of natural flood management where possible, including quantification. We're looking at a range of NFM measures in different types of catchments, flooding scenarios, and at different scales. And the aim is to improve evidence and understanding for policymakers and practitioners. There are 3 research projects making up the programme. You can see them listed there, and there's more on our website about those, and in fact they each have their own individual websites as well. But the projects are working closely together, and we'll present programme findings and recommendations as well as individual project level ones. So drawing on the expertise of partners and engaging with them in our work is critical to its success, and the webinar programme really is part of that. So I'm just flashing up lots of logos to give you an idea of the partners. Oops, sorry. Hit the wrong button there. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you wouldn't have thought I've done this about 10 times before.
Makes me feel better.
That's right. Yeah, so whilst Kathy and the South East Rivers Trust, what Kathy's going to talk about isn't directly part of the research programme, there are strong links, and part of the goal of the webinar programme is to provide a platform for people like Kathy to share their work and really build understanding and strengthen the network within the natural flood management community. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Kathy.
Thank you, Gerald. I'll share my slides. When I do that, I'm going to cut out for a second, so don't do anything while that happens, please. Okay. Great. Can you just confirm that you can actually see everything?
Coming up. It's coming up now.
Okay.
Coming up now.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Okay. Well, while that happens, yeah. First of all, thanks, Gerald, for the introduction. And yeah, it is really interesting for us, I guess, to be able to share what we've done so far, because the project I'm going to talk about mostly is very much an ongoing project. And having had a look through the program of people that you've got talking, I feel like I'm probably very much more on the practitioner side than a lot of the very distinguished researchers that you've got on alongside. So hopefully I can add some sort of useful perspective of how we've managed to work with our resources on our scale and the learning that we've had through that. If you can see everything now, I'll start with the presentation.
Yeah, we can see your slides. Yeah.
Great, brilliant. So I thought I'd start with just a quick introduction and then go a little bit through how we've actually looked at measuring natural capital, because that's a focus of the project, what we're focusing on in our project in terms of the assets or habitats and the services that we're measuring, and then go through the monitoring setup for each context, because the focus of the presentation was around monitoring infiltration and retention to support assessment of ecosystem services. I thought what might be quite useful would be to see what we've actually done on each of our sites to understand that infiltration and retention. So hopefully that will be interesting. And then just a few sort of lessons learned on where we're going next with it. And I think that should leave us enough time for questions at the end. So just to start off, South East Rivers Trust is an organisation that's really existed since about 2000, but we used to be the Wandle Trust, focused just on a catchment in South London, the River Wandle, which is a small chalk stream. We've since expanded, and since 2014, we've been the South East Rivers Trust, and we work in 12 catchment partnerships across 7 counties and 5 water company areas. So we have quite a wide range of contexts and catchments and partners that we're engaging with. What is common to all of them is that water scarcity is a key issue that also affects our river systems. So while this is an NFM focused webinar series, water resources are a key part of our work, and very much the flip side, I think, of that, too much water, too little water, when and where is it in the catchment. So for us, our mission is conserving and restoring rivers and their catchments across the southeast of England. So that fits very much within that. So achieving healthy river ecosystems for all is what we're here for. And my role in that is as a natural capital coordinator. So I can imagine that by my name and accent, you've worked out that I'm not actually from the southeast of England. I've come here through having done a degree at the University of Edinburgh, and kind of stuck around for a while after that. So I'm also not a monitoring expert, so this is very much my experience of what I've learned over the last few years and how we've basically worked together in our organisation with our partners to develop this project. So this is more of a disclaimer, but hopefully that actually gives quite a useful perspective on on what we've been able to do with that. So my role as natural capital coordinator is really quite wide-ranging, but everything within it is focused around water resources and natural capital. So trying to look at how we can understand our catchments in a way that allows us to manage them sustainably and to get the benefits out of them that we need and want, while not basically destroying the environment alongside that. And the project that allows me to do that is called PROWATER. That stands for Protecting and Restoring Raw Water Sources Through Actions at the Landscape Scale. It's obviously a European funded project because they tend to have the longest names and acronyms. It's an Interreg 2Cs project running from late 2018 to 2022, so it's very much an ongoing project. So what I'm talking about today is basically what we've got so far halfway through the project, and then hopefully there'll be a lot of learning still to come. There's a range of partners involved, but in the southeast of England, it's really us as in South East Rivers Trust, and then Kent County Council and South East Water are 2 partner organisations delivering alongside us. And we've got a range of observers that are not directly involved in the project, but that help steer where it's going, and that includes Southern Water, SAS Water, and Affinity Water, as well as Natural England. In the project, we've got 3 pilot areas that we're focusing on, and I've put a map up there So you can see the hydrogeology of those. So we're looking at quite an interesting context where we've got brook aquifers as well as surface water catchments on clay geology. They're all quite representative of the sort of hydrological context that we find in the region and the sort of issues that we expect with each of them. They're all important for drinking water abstraction. So each of those catchments has been selected because it's of a key interest to the water companies involved as well. And in each of those, we're delivering a range of measures that basically serves as demonstration measures for what we'd want to see rolled out across the catchments and the region, really. So that use of ecosystem-based adaptation measures is there to protect and restore water resources. So really about looking at resilience to climate change, both in terms of drought as well as flooding to some extent. Part of the project is developing a GIS-based targeting and impact assessment tool. So a lot of the evidence that we're looking at here and some of the monitoring that we're doing is really about ground truthing that as well. And ultimately, we want that to allow us to develop a natural capital approach for investment in those catchments. So looking at water as well as the wider benefits in that. So it's about understanding our assets and the services they provide. And again, we're not a research project, so our monitoring is really mainly about impact assessment and ground truthing what we're doing. But it's obviously helping us to build up local evidence and be a bit more robust in our decision making. Again, it's very much focused on water resources, so I'm going to talk mainly about water resources because that's what I'm comfortable with, but it is the flip side of natural flood management, really. So it is about retaining water in the catchment and not having it at the wrong time of the year in the wrong place, I guess. So hopefully the learnings that we've had and the sort of things that I'll talk about will be useful in both contexts. I thought I'd start with a quick graphic of what we're actually looking at. So the issues that we're focusing on in our catchments are really representative for the wider area and for different opportunities that we have for using those ecosystem-based adaptation measures. So we're really looking at things like poor soil management, degraded river channels, extensive drainage that degrades wetlands. That's a historic issue, but that's really widespread, and that basically means that those natural assets that we rely on for our water resources aren't able to provide them that well at the moment, and they're likely really vulnerable to climate change in the future. So there's a range of things that we can do to improve that, and that we can do to improve the health of our natural assets, and the ones that we're focusing on are up on this graphic here. So it's really around soil management, attenuation features, river restoration. So it's the sort of things that Gerard was talking about earlier that are being looked at in other NFM focused projects as well. So what we'll focus on today really is how can we show the impact of what we're delivering with those measures, and how can we show that in a robust way. So what's really the evidence that we can bring to the table about that it's worth investing in these things. And to do that, I thought we could go back to just thinking about measuring change in natural capital and ecosystem services first of all, and look at our natural capital across the catchment, how it provides services, and using a framework that's been set out for quite a while in the literature, which I really like because it gives a really sort of structured approach to how we can use different indicators to look at different aspects of our natural assets. So if we think about our natural capital, it's basically a stock of assets. It's all our elements of nature that provide benefits. So it's the sort of static bits of nature that we can work with. So wetlands, fresh water, or species, and we can categorize them by their extent, their location, and their condition. And all of those factors play a role in how well they can provide certain services, how healthy they are, and whether we might want to manage them in a different way or whether we might need to restore them. And we can then go on to actually looking at the ecosystem services, so the flow of benefits that we get from them. So that can be done in a physical way, so thinking about volumes of water, for example, or in a monetary way where we actually go the next step and put a value on that physical flow. And to do that, I feel like this always starts sounding quite straightforward until you really look into it in detail, and it gets much more complicated and frustrating. But a really good starting point for us, I think, was looking at the Natural England natural capital logic chains and the indicators that they've set out. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about them, but I've put the link in case anyone's interested or doesn't know it yet. But it's basically a starting point to look at all these elements of how we can look at our natural capital and how we can measure change in it, and think about the location and condition that might be relevant for that specific habitat or asset and that ecosystem service that it's providing, and then looking at what data we have available to understand whether that is currently provided whether that asset is currently in a good state or not, or whether it's providing those ecosystem services. So it's really about monitoring that change if we restore it and seeing whether we can improve our natural capital, or whether it's deteriorating, whether it's providing more or less service. And to some extent, it's also just about understanding what good actually looks like, which can be quite a challenge at times as well, I think. So brief overview of what evidence there is already, going back to those indicators, has been pulled together in the Natural Capital Atlas that's come out recently. So I don't know whether people have seen that, but it's a really lovely document produced by West Country Rivers Trust for Natural England, or with Natural England, and it basically brings together all these different indicators that Natural England had set out initially, where data is available on a national scale, and breaks it down so that we can basically have a really useful baseline to look at the condition that our assets are in across counties in this case. So I've taken out an example from the Kent Natural Capital Atlas, but it's obviously available on a national scale. So that's a really good starting point for us to understand where we are, and then start filling in the local detail and comparing progress against that baseline, really. So on some of that, you can probably see from those maps that data isn't necessarily always available at the scale at which we want to make our changes. So helping us to decide how we then bring in our monitoring and our evidence into this framework is probably the best thing that we can do with it. So I thought the next step should be actually just looking at the natural assets that we're working with in our project, and we're focusing on semi-natural grasslands, wetlands, woodlands, and soils, and I've added geology in, which isn't really something that we'd call a habitat, obviously, but that is really important in terms of thinking about the location of where we're working. So the obvious difference there is whether we're on a chalk aquifer or whether we're in a clay catchment, and that makes a huge difference to the sorts of things that we might be able to deliver, or the sorts of services that are being provided by different habitats anyway. So all of those assets would be found across our catchments, and all of them are in some way impacted by mismanagement or degradation in some way. So for our natural grasslands on chalk, for example, it's quite common that they're scrubbed up, that they're turning into gorse, or for some extent woodland. Wetlands happen to be drained quite a lot, so agricultural ditches are really common. Under drainage is really common, so obviously to have productive agricultural land, waterlogged soils aren't that helpful, so that's quite extensive. Soil management and poor soil management is common as an issue. I think that's something that we are all quite aware of. So all of those are starting points for us in doing our work, which then helps us think back to thinking back to those natural capital indicators and that framework. We can try and think about these different assets in those three categories of where they are, what condition they're in, and what service they're providing. So this is just a sort of best estimate. So the table that I've put up there is basically us trying to identify how we can select different indicators that help us understand our natural assets across our catchments best. So trying to break it down into hydrology, nutrient and chemical status, and vegetation, for example. Each of those give us a different bit of insight into how well our headwater streams, for example, or our headwater wetlands are currently functioning, whether they're likely to be able to provide the services that we need, and whether they're just simply in a healthy condition. And then we can also look at the actual service that they're providing. So in our case, water provision is the key point of interest. So looking at how much water is actually flowing towards an abstraction point from that asset is a key aspect for us. So with that aim of providing water resources, there's three key things that we're interested in our project, and that's land cover conversion, soil management, and wetland restoration. And the aim of that is protecting and increasing recharge to the chalk aquifer, where we are on the chalk aquifer, and we can do that by reducing interception and evapotranspiration losses from vegetation, or by increasing infiltration and retention capacity in the soil. We can slow the flow and buffer extreme events in our clay catchment, so it's about retaining more water in the landscape, really, and that can again be increasing infiltration capacity of soil. It can be increasing the wider retention capacity of the landscape, and reducing rapid drainage. And of course, we're also interested in water quality alongside that. So sediment and nutrients, for example, are some key factors that we want to see an improvement in as well. They affect quite a wide range of our catchments, and all of those measures should have an impact on those elements as well. So the monitoring that we're doing is about how our interventions impact the indicators that that we have set out and that are set out by Natural England that help us think about that service and asset condition, and it's about validating the tools that we're developing and really about the assumptions that we're making as well. So a lot of it is also about helping us really understand what our habitats and our catchments are doing and how the parts of it that we're maybe not able to monitor on a national level are actually working. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about each of our 3 measures and how we're monitoring them on site. So it's basically 3 times the same setup that I'll go through, and I hope it'll be really interesting, and hopefully people have questions afterwards. So I'll start with my favorite, land cover conversion. This is a really interesting one because it feels like it's quite contentious because everyone loves trees and we love trees, but it's also about looking at whether we have the right trees in the right place, as everyone seems to say at the moment. So this one is looking at whether converting high water use land cover trees to low water use like grass and heather on shallow soils over chalk increases infiltration. So we know that that's quite an established evidence base on a range of those habitats already, but it also turns out that local conditions have a massive influence on what we actually know, and the type of aquifer and geology that we have and the species that we're looking at can make quite a big difference locally. So while there is a lot that we know, we do feel like having that more local evidence in this case and giving us more confidence in the choices that we make is really valuable. So our aim is increasing recharge to the chalk aquifer, and to some extent, I've added this in so I don't forget it, it's also about protecting biodiversity. So I'm very much focusing on water resources here, but all of these measures that we're talking about obviously have wider benefits as well. But the monitoring that we're doing is really focused around quantifying the water resource benefits. So the indicator that we've chosen to monitor in this case is about drainage. So at the volumetric water content across the soil profile. So really how much water is going into the soil and how much water is making it all the way down towards the chalk aquifer. And that's really focusing on the flow of ecosystem services in that case. So we could have looked at a lot of other elements, and I put in the little graphic on the right-hand side there from a paper that I read when I was trying to work out how we could do our monitoring. That made my head hurt slightly because it's so many different elements, and obviously this is great and it's really extensive and it's really robust, but we can't afford that and we don't have the time to do that. And it's also so many different factors that we probably wouldn't ever get around to actually analyzing any of that data. So we've gone for a much simpler setup where we're basically comparing 5 habitat types in 3 locations in the same area of interest. So this is all in Freston Forest, where a large part of the land use is currently beech plantation, but there's elements of it that are chalk grassland and chalk heathland, and they're both SSS and a national nature reserve. So it's really interesting for us to understand the difference between those different habitat types in that context. And the setup that we've got is basically a before-after measure control setup. So we've got a year of data before we put a measure in place where we've installed 3 soil moisture profile probes on each of those sites. So we've got one on a measure control site for each of those habitats, except for the chalk heathland and chalk grassland, because we're not touching that. That's just staying exactly the same. So we've only got 1 site for each of those habitats. And for the other 3, so gorse scrub and deciduous woodland, we're basically leaving 1 in place and taking 1 away, so we have a good comparison. That's been running since early 2020, so we're aiming to convert that land in January 2021, so it's not long now. So we've got a year of data to start with, and then we've got another year or 2 of control data and of data once it's changed until the project finishes. And the equipment that we've used are 120 centimeter soil moisture profile probes that show us the volumetric water content every 10 centimeters down to a depth of 120 centimeters. So there's probably still some root systems that can go beyond that, but this is the best estimate that we can get for potential recharge, really, where we can look at the water that actually makes it beyond the soil profile and beyond the root zone in most cases and into the chalk. So it gives us a good comparison. And you can see on the right hand side there that's an example of what that data looks like. So we can see that, for example, there in April, there was a rainfall event that basically didn't make it any further than the first layer of soil, because at that point, plants take up most of that water, so we don't get any recharge. Alongside that, we're monitoring rainfall in those locations as well, and we've got porous pots installed that allow us water quality sampling. So it gives us a good idea of what the water quality is in those habitats as well. So just some additional evidence about the value of that. Why does it matter? This is just an example of if we take the numbers that are just based on the sort of evidence base that's there already, changing one of those habitats, so for example, a hectare of woodland to a hectare of grassland, or a hectare of coniferous woodland or gorse to a hectare of heather, can have a massive impact on water resource provision. So if we look at that on a larger scale, that's something that could be really valuable in the future, especially in some of those areas where there might be additional interests like biodiversity interests. At the same time, obviously, we have to be quite conscious that woodlands are really valuable, and this isn't about taking away ancient woodlands or natural woodlands that are providing all those functions. But it's just something that we're really interested in, and that should be a part of how we make decisions about land use. Just some practical bits that we came across while we were doing that. Site selection was really important, so we were trying to be quite good about selecting within that area sites that were obviously on a similar soil, but also a similar level of exposure, a similar patch size, of similar height and topography compared to each other. So we are trying to sort of minimize the variation within that as much as possible. Obviously, there are only 3 probes in each of those, so we do appreciate that it's not the most robust setup, but this is probably the maximum that we could have got to with the resources that we had. Another thing is that hydrological years obviously start in October, so if you want to capture a whole recharge period, then it's not much point starting in the new year, which people probably know, but someone who's not a water resource person didn't really think about, to be quite honest. We were working on SSIs, so choice of equipment was quite important for us. So part of the reason why we went for the soil moisture probes that we went with was that they are actually hardly disruptive. So they you drill them in and they sit quite flush with the chalk and the soil around them. So there's very little spoil, and we can fill that back in when we leave, and hopefully that will basically mean no disruption at all for those sites. Turns out that agricultural equipment can be very similar and much cheaper than research equipment. So the soil moisture probes that we got were actually from an agricultural irrigation company, and they seem to be doing the job quite well. Another point that people probably know, but I only really paid attention to once it had happened, was that sheep, rabbits and ponies are very curious about cables and poles. They do like nibbling or pushing them over. Solar panels also don't work in woodlands, so you have to have someone very committed that will actually climb into the tree and install the solar panel quite high up. And also, if you're monitoring gorse, gorse is not the most convenient of habitats to crawl into. So it's good to choose when you are on site and when you let other people go instead of you. Moving on to the second measure that we're looking at, headwater wetland restoration. So this is in our clay catchment. So groundwater recharge is not really a consideration for us here. It's about buffering those extreme events. And the approach that we've taken here is that we focused on headwaters because they are important in terms of their hydrology. And they're also part of, when the project was starting, a model that the University of Antwerp, who we were working with, identified through their spatial prioritization modeling. They developed a tool that was based on a topographic position index to basically help us identify areas that would naturally be wet for longer and would be well suited to providing those storage areas. So that's how we've selected our sites. Again, we know that headwater streams and wetlands are really important, and we know that they are often degraded, but we also know that wetland hydrological function is quite complex. And just that little table that looks that you can't read at all, but just for reference, that I've put there out of a paper from 2003 that's reviewed the wetland hydrological functions, just shows again how we can't just say that wetlands store and retain water. They can contribute to more flooding downstream. They can act as a source for water flowing downstream. They don't necessarily retain and then slowly release water. It's not that simple. So part of this for us is really to look at what the areas that we're working with are really doing, and how we can use them best to make our regulating water regulating functions more resilient. So the aim for us is to retain and store water in the catchment and to moderate flows, but we do really want to understand whether the measures that we're putting in place are really doing that. So the indicators that we've chosen here are looking at surface water flow. So that is both an indicator for the actual provision of that service to some extent, so how much water is actually being contributed by that headwater wetland, but it's also an indicator for the condition of that wetland itself, so depending on how flashy those flows are or how natural they are in any case. And then we're also looking at soil water tables, so that is very much looking at the asset itself. And I've just put in a little flow graph to just show the river belt is quite a flashy catchment. So yeah, it's very much clay soils pretty much all over, but it's also lots of agricultural landscapes and not much woodlands left. So that in terms of that landscape retention function, there's probably lots of things that we could be doing to change that. And you can see a map on the right-hand side there. So the catchment is quite big, and the two circles that I've added in are showing approximately where our sites are. So they are very much, one is very much in the headwaters, and then one is sort of focusing on the tributary headwaters. So those sites look like that. The top one is in a productive livestock farm, and the bottom one is basically a farm that is mainly managed for conservation purposes already, with a little bit of woodland and a little bit of species-rich grassland. And you can see those dark green areas that look sort of like little arms or fingers sticking out. That's what our modelling identified as those headwater wetland areas. And through all of those are nice big agricultural ditches. So what we're looking at is this sort of context. So it's quite typical, really. And the aim, or what we're looking at in terms of measures there, is basically regrading the streams so that that drainage function that those agricultural ditches are currently carrying out is reduced a little bit. We could have focused on just monitoring one location in a lot more detail, but we kind of like the idea that we could compare those three habitats against each other, and that hopefully that would give us a bit more insight into how these different land cover types are actually responding. So that would be really interesting. It's also been really interesting working with the farmers and seeing what they're interested in terms of monitoring too. So the setup that we've got in each of those is that we've had level loggers in the stream since early this year. So we were fortunate enough to actually capture those March rainfalls. So they gave us a really good peak flow event to see what happens. And then we've just installed V-notch weirs to really be able to measure flow and not just water levels. And we're also installing dip wells so that we can see the soil water tables. The measures are meant to go in place, so the actual work is meant to be undertaken next spring or early summer. So we'll have a winter of just baseline data, and then we'll have another winter after having installed intervention to see the comparison. We're also looking at VES soil structure assessments alongside that, just to get a better understanding of the soils that we're working with. And this is a sort of schematic indication of what we're imagining that it'll look like. We're currently still designing the details of how we want that to work in each of those sites. But the idea is that we're basically regrading the channel so that it spreads water out more. It basically creates more of a wetland habitat, where at the moment we've got quite dry meadows with just a water body or water course running through them. So some of that might be about introducing woody debris as well, and just using soil from the site and creating scrapes alongside it maybe. But the details of that we're still working out really. This is just to show what that actually looks like as an aerial view. So this is the conservation meadow site. So there's one part that is arable, as you can see, and it's basically just we're really lucky with this one because this is really a tiny little catchment. So we can actually understand what happens in it, which does make it a lot easier. And in all of those, they're all smaller than 3 square kilometers, so they're sort of fairly manageable for us, at least in terms of knowing what happens and knowing who owns the land that impacts it. So that really helps. And then we've just got this level logger right at the bottom of that ditch, and we'll look at basically infilling all of that length. And you can see in dark blue what the modelling by the University of Antwerp is showing us as the area that I would expect to wet up more, so we can see whether anything changes in that area really, and then we can compare rainfall events against each other to some extent, and just look at flow duration curves before and after. And just like I said earlier, just simply understanding the actual volume that those headwaters contribute in terms of flow, I think will be really interesting. The V-notches have been installed, but we're yet to actually calibrate them because it hasn't rained enough for water to be flowing in those ditches. So that will be the next challenge for us. And yeah, hopefully that'll go well, but probably something to talk about in the future. Some points to take away from there. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation where when we started the project, we didn't know where or what exactly we were delivering, but we were really keen to get baseline data, which I think is probably a common problem, especially in EU projects like this. So that sort of what do we do if we don't know where we're going and how we can do it was a bit tricky. So that's partly why we just don't have the same amount of baseline data that we'd want to have if it was meant to be a research study, but we're doing what we can with the knowledge that we have and the time that we have really. Inputs and loss this one, but just checking that you're not missing any sort of underground drain pipes that you weren't aware were coming in was quite a revelation sometimes. That decision about whether to put a little bit everywhere or everything in one location was quite a key discussion in the team. So that's, I think, I'm not sure whether that is the right answer. I'm sure people have strong opinions on that, but for us, I think this has worked quite well in just getting spreading our eggs across multiple baskets, I suppose. Then just installing the equipment in the right place so that actually records changes. So basically, is all your water actually going to flow over your V-notch beer at the end, or is it going to spread out and go somewhere else? Again, mainly a design question, but that was something to think about. One other thing that's seemed really key is just regular sampling. It's really time intensive to go out and check and download our data regularly. So it's worth investing to some extent in telemetry if you can. We weren't able to do that. We are going out quite regularly, but we've got data loggers that at least mean we don't have to constantly make sure that we're there in key rainfall events, which does make it easier, especially because those sites are quite far apart and quite a way to travel for most of us. The quality of loggers and error range, again, is just a discussion about what budget we have and how much we need to do. But it's something that I think we could have considered earlier in the project, and we probably just didn't think of it early on. And then checking on your equipment and not trying to be too clever. I think my colleague Ed is probably on this call and he will laugh at this because I thought I was trying to be really clever, putting our level loggers as close to the channel bottom as possible so that it would record really low flows. And when I went to check on it in July, after we obviously hadn't been able to go out for quite a long time, it had basically become a breeding ground for spiders and bugs, which is lovely, but it's not looking too good now. So it's just, yeah, mainly a learning point for me about designing how I'm actually putting those things in place. Right, and the last measure, improving soil health. So this is again something that I think Landwise is looking at in quite a lot of detail. So I'm really curious to see what comes out of that. But what we've done so far is we've basically, the first point was recognizing how important soil health is, how much we know it can contribute across catchments to reducing runoff. So I've put a graph in there from a study from Cranfield in 2010 that people seem to be quite familiar with, but I think it's still worth referencing about how much of a difference good soil management can make to reducing runoff rates. So that's a modeling study, and the main thing that we're doing really is about just ground truthing some of the assumptions that we're making behind this sort of understanding. So just looking at actually our soils and their infiltration rates. So we're focusing on agriculturally managed soils, livestock pasture and an equestrian pasture in our pilot sites. So we've got 2 sites where we are delivering soil health improvement measures. And in our case, they mainly are about introducing a more diverse deep rooting species mix. So basically a type of herbal ley, as it's called if it's in an arable rotation, I think, to look at improving drought resilience, so deeper rooting crops that can basically make the farm more resilient, but also that help drainage. So this is partly about summer storms as much as it is about about creating a more stable flow. Because if we're thinking about climate change and about the intense summer storms that are likely to become more problematic, then having those deep rooting systems, while on the one hand it could mean that you have more evapotranspiration loss, it could also mean that, especially on your clay soils, that water can actually infiltrate rather than running off your baked clay. So that's it's just a key consideration, especially in the surface water catchment. But equally important in the chalk catchment, where even those thin soils on chalk, especially where they're on steep slopes, can be issues for surface water runoff if they're not managed well. And so having solid root structures and building up organic matter can be a way of creating resilience against that. Equestrian is a really interesting one in this context, because we think that there's a lot less engagement around equestrian management. So we focus quite a lot on livestock, but we haven't worked much with horse owners, and often they're harder to reach as well. So we're really quite lucky to work with a horse farmer or stud farm that is trialing those measures with us. So that would be quite useful to take forward. And the other one, livestock pasture, especially, so that's in the belt catchment. It's the most common land use in the belt catchment, and it's part of one of the key issues around the Water Framework Directive in terms of soil and nutrient management. Soil management impacts, again, are quite context specific from what we've learned. So the soil type, the climate, and the land cover obviously all play a role. So while it's a complex interaction to start with, and then making it relevant to specifically where you are is another thing. And one thing that has really helped us is not just in terms of increasing the robustness of our evidence, it's also about having local evidence that the landowners are really interested in. So it is just a lot more helpful having that insight from soils that they are familiar with and that they've worked on. The indicators that we've chosen are, again, volumetric water content. So we're looking at drainage through the soil. That's, again, focusing quite a lot on the ecosystem service flow, although it's a little bit about the condition of the asset as well anyway. And then we're looking at soil structure, infiltration rate, nutrient and organic matter status in those soils. So the setup that we've got is, I've talked a little bit about the two soil types now, but we've got basically the same setup repeated once on the chalk soils and once on the livestock clay soils. So they're slightly different species mixes so that they're relevant to the specific issues that they have. So chalk and clay, or the thin chalk soils are slightly different to what happens on the heavier clay soils. So on the clay, it's really about looking at the lower layers of that subsoil and improving the drainage adjacent to a watercourse, and on the chalk it's about building up that organic matter, improving infiltration on the slopes as well as in the valley bottom in a source protection zone catchment. So it's directly above a groundwater abstraction for a drinking water supply point. So it's not just important in terms of water quantity, it's also obviously got massive water quality implications, what happens on the land above that. The setup that we've got for those is, again, a measure and control setup. Especially with the soil moisture probes that we've put in place, we've only really got the comparison between measure and control, so we don't actually have any baseline data, but we do have some baseline for the BESS assessment that we did. So on each of those, on the measure and control and on both sites, we've done 5 BESS assessments, so looking at soil structure, and 5 infiltration tests each, and they will be repeated next year and then the year after, so we'll have a sort of a nice short timeline of change. The infiltration test that we've gone for is a very simplified version of the more detailed method that you can do, where we've basically used a 20-centimeter ring filled with an inch of water and repeated 3 times, simply because we can't really do the alternatives very easily unless we had a researcher with us that had the time basically to invest in that. And we've also done 15 soil samples on each to look at the nutrient status and organic matter, so to try and really build up a good picture of the soil that we're working with. And they will be repeated at the end of the project as well, so we have a good before and after comparison. They'll also allow us to map the soil condition, so that'll be quite interesting to map it against some of that modelling that we've done that shows us those different infiltration zones. So on the chalk, we're really interested in seeing that drainage to the chalk again, so it's about how long and how much water actually drains into the chalk beyond the root zone. And on the clay, it's really about seeing whether our infiltration rates improve and whether we can see that drainage happening to a deeper depth, so an indicator of being able to store water a bit better and potentially having an impact on the flow regime in the watercourses adjacent. with the infiltration test, we could probably have used a slightly different method. I was really worried that it would take us forever to basically do the simple tests, because I thought the infiltration rates would be much slower. But even so, there's the established method that the FAO uses is basically looking at how much water can infiltrate in an hour. But if we wanted to do that and repeat it twice, then doing one site on its own would take 10 hours, whereas at the moment it's taking us 3 to 5 hours to do the whole like one site with measure and control together. So it's just a time constraint to some extent, but it's also about whether we have access to water. So it turns out you're quite limited in how far you can walk if you're carrying around a bucket with 20 litres of water. So that was a consideration that I hadn't really thought of until I had to think about how many water bottles I could actually carry to site. It can't be too dry or too wet for sampling, which was a little bit of a challenge this summer, because we've not really been able to go on site visits as much as we would have been anyway, and then being able to time that with when it was raining and when it wasn't raining was quite difficult. The other thing is just that it helps having strong arms. Yeah, especially under heavy clay soils, it's quite hard getting out of the ground, which I think everyone knows as well, but that was a good lesson to learn. The last thing I thought I'd talk about specifically with regards to our monitoring was about the costs involved with it, because I think that was one of the key learning points for us really about starting and thinking that we had loads of budget and we could do so many different things with it, and then things quite quickly start adding up. So I thought it might just be quite useful, especially for practitioners, to review what we actually spent on some of that. So we bought level loggers and barometric loggers to look at water levels. We need the baro logger because we went for absolute level loggers rather than ones that don't need a baro logger, which are about 3 times as expensive. We bought some V-notch weirs. We bought dip wells and stilling wells, which together with the infiltration ring probably are the cheapest things that we've ever bought, because the infiltration ring is basically just a plastic drain pipe that costs about £3, and the dip wells and stilling wells are very similar. The soil moisture profile probes are really expensive, so the cheapest ones that we got were about £800, and you can rent them or buy them, so that's a really good option for us to just think about. In some cases we might actually not want to have them much longer, or we might not want to be responsible for maintaining them, so that was really useful. Rain gauge was about £200, and I think that was the cheapest one that we could find as part of the setup with the soil moisture probes. The soil sampling is costing us between £15 and £50 per sample, depending on the detail that we're asking for and whether we are getting the map report alongside it. The telemetry access and the comms kit cost on top of that. The water quality monitoring that we're doing cost us another £5,000, and the porous pots are being installed by the water companies that are part of the project through a separate budget pot, so we don't actually have to pay for those, but that would add another few £1,000 simply for the time of someone going out and sampling them every 2 weeks in the winter. The installation kit that we need for all of those is obviously to some extent an investment, and then it's just taken us a lot of time to design it, to actually do the site investigations and get a better idea of what we can do, where we can do it, research what we actually want to do, get advice from lots of people, install them, check up on all these different bits, repair them when they break, go and download that data and actually analyze it. So I think we tend to find it quite easy, and other people might have different experiences in different organizations, but I think that's the experience that we've had, that monitoring is often something that you want to think of as an afterthought, because, oh yes, we should really do that, it would be really important to do it, but we'll just work out how much of it we can do. But it turns out you can't do very much at all if you don't put some effort into it. So I think that's been something that I hope was a key learning point for us, that going forward we would think about this much more at the beginning, which I think any good researcher would obviously tell you, and I think we all know that in theory, but it's just the practicalities of it don't always translate into being able to do it. And sometimes you just can't, sometimes you have to react to situations, and that's fine too, but it can be quite a challenge, I think. So my last learning points were really getting help if you can. It would have been a lot harder doing this if I hadn't had some really good colleagues around me from various organizations that have all helped to understand it, and basically given me their 2Ps on each of it, and been around for discussions, because like I said in the beginning, it's not my expertise, but that happens quite a lot, I think, where we still have to make decisions about that and work out how we monitor our projects without having that expertise and without having all the resources available that we might want to have. There's some really good resources out there from the catchment-based approach, for example, around catchment science, but also from the River Restoration Centre. They've developed that Pragma guidance that came out a few years ago. I think that was really useful. And last, everyone's going to tell you something slightly different. So it's just keeping it simple and giving it a go. And remembering that you can't always get what you want, but you can get what you need. Right, are you about to cut me off, Jared? It's my last slide, I promise.
No, if you could wrap up quite quickly, so we've got some time for questions, but I wasn't going to cut.
Sorry, I've lost track of the minutes. My timer stopped in front of me. But yeah, so I was just going to say what we are actually going to do with that evidence is this is going to help us understand our asset condition and the flow of our services. So really trying to understand the capacity that the assets that we're working with, so the habitats and the bits of land that different landowners have, what those can deliver in terms of the public goods that we're looking at in the future, and how we can manage them, because it's really understanding the different bits of the environment that people can manage, and improving the knowledge that we have about that and about the different elements in our catchments is really valuable for us as a Rivers Trust, and valuable for the partners that we share it with. It's just adding another detail to the picture of multiple benefits. So water resources is something that I think we probably don't know as much about as we'd like to. It's local evidence for local decisions, so it makes people feel more comfortable. And lastly, it's just about using all of that to make a case for investing in resilient catchments through the environmental land management schemes as and when it comes, and or through private funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Really interesting. You covered a lot of ground there. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions, so I'll ask you some. We had some submitted before the webinar, so thanks to people who sent those. So there's two here that I think go together quite.
Gerard, could I just stop sharing my screen for a second so I can turn the video back on?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
It'll just cut me out for a moment, that's why.
Oh,
okay.
Hi,
thank you.
Hi. Right. Yes, there are two questions which I can perhaps lump together. It's about, can you say anything about rainfall infiltration rates as a function of intensity, land use and soil type? And another question is there a proxy for anticipated infiltration change in the Natural Capital Atlas?
Yeah, so I don't think I'm not sure exactly what was meant by a proxy for infiltration change, but I think in terms of understanding what the potential is about improving infiltration rates in soil, there's two things that I found in the Natural Capital Atlas, or three actually. So it includes mapping for soil organic matter, for the vegetation cover and soil biota, and then I guess the change in infiltration rate, as the other question alludes to, is a function of land cover, soil management, and the sort of rainfall intensity, among other things. And with that, what we have actually done is we got Cranfield University to do to get someone to do a master's project on running a curve number model on what type or on how much land use management or soil conditions affect infiltration rates and annual runoff from our catchments. So that's part of a method that they've used for various water stewardship projects, actually. So there's an established method out there for modeling that, and we are basically using some of the monitoring data that we're collecting, and just especially looking at our soils to ground truth whether our soils actually are in the state that they're predicted that they are. So yeah, just trying to use that sort of model evidence and then just ground truth it with the local data that we have on the actual soils that are there and the infiltration rates that we can see on the ground.
Okay, thanks. And actually, there's a question come in about what models did you use to decide on your monitoring and intervention sites?
So the sites that we chose were we based mainly on a model that the University of Antwerp developed for water resources in Belgium, where they were looking at the sort of hydrogeology and the way that water moved around their landscape, which identified 3 different zones for infiltration, focus, retention, and groundwater recharge, or attenuation rather. The only issue with that was that it turned out that they mainly have shallow groundwater tables and sandy aquifers, which is quite different to the chalk aquifers that we have. So that was a bit frustrating. But then on top of that, we basically added in a few other layers of information. So we looked at groundwater vulnerability, we looked at the organic carbon content in a soil model by CAH in Natural England, and a few other factors on the chalk side. So we basically chose our target sites based on a multi-criteria analysis, really. And in the belt, we did stick to, so in the surface water catchment, we did actually stick to that model that the University of Antwerp had developed, because we found from catchment walkovers that it did actually represent wetland areas quite well. So we basically just chose areas that were identified as being those headwater wetland areas, and that's where we then contacted farmers and started looking at the sites on the ground, and basically just try and choose as confined sites as possible so that we could have a good idea of what was happening.
Okay, thank you. Can you say anything about the potential for affordable flood mitigation steps that could be taken by small village councils?
Yes. I think there's a few things, and I imagine there's other people that have much more to say on this than I do, but from a different project that colleagues of mine are mainly working on that is focused on natural flood management, they are looking at, so I think the first thing is it very much depends on the scale of flooding that you're looking at. So there's probably lots of things that you can do to avoid the sort of more, the smaller but more frequent flood events, like looking at upstream land management, looking at introducing leaky barriers. So a lot of that, I think, is working with landowners in those catchments and just identifying areas for opportunities, because I think what we found is that people are very willing to do something if they know that it's going to be useful. So that would be a first step. And then soil management, I think, is a key factor in that. But it's it's little, in terms of thinking about natural processes, that sort of thing of trying to work with your land managers around you and identify where there are opportunities for holding back water can be quite cost effective and can be really effective in smaller contexts. But obviously it's nothing one year flood happening probably.
Thanks. How much R&D has been completed on all world trees to discover if importing and planting maximum absorbing trees would or would not be viable?
Oh, I don't think I know much. I'm not sure I understand the question completely, but I think what we have seen is some farmers or some landowners being quite interested in importing or in planting fast-growing trees that can take up quite a lot of water, including in areas that are already water stressed, where we would see that as not being viable because it would put too much pressure on water resources, most likely. I don't know how much R&D has been done, and I don't know what the sort of state of the art is in that, to be honest. But that's just from the sort of things that I have seen and heard people ask about. Okay,
well, if anybody in the webinar knows more, please
let us know.
Yeah, let us know. Yes, exactly. Is the infiltration measurement a standard in measuring towards calculations around abstraction and recharge towards abstraction licensing? And then water company planning, question mark.
I'm going to try and answer that. I think it's very much a question that I would love to have someone from the EA water resource team here, because they would know much better than me. But I think what happens when that is being assessed is that you can calculate potential recharge, and part of that is basically modeling how much of your rainfall is going to make it to your groundwater body, and that would include things like how much water is being stored in the soil and how much is being taken up by trees. So whether specifically, so you would look at modeled infiltration rates, but I'm not sure how often that is then ground truthed, if that answers part of the question, I hope.
Okay, thank you. Has a national water network been considered, similar to road, rail, energy, telecoms, to redistribute floodwater when emergency arises? An expensive option, but technically feasible, and perhaps a 50-year plus ROI. I'm not quite sure what that stands
Return on
for.
investment.
Oh yes, thank you. Might be worth considering.
Yeah, I guess the answer to that is sort of yes in a way, I imagine. I'm not sure specifically about floodwaters, but there's a group called the Water Resources Southeast Group that is starting to pull together a regional plan for water resources in the region for basically looking at 100 years into the future. And they are looking at things like water transfers over quite large distances. So addressing that balance that's kind of mentioned about when you have water available in one area, but not in another, and how you can balance that out. Which, yeah, so I think water transfers like that are very much being considered, or storage areas like that. They come with other environmental costs that you also need to account for, I think. So you've got pros and cons, but yeah, it's definitely something that's on the cards. So I'd say look at regional water resource planning if that's something you're interested in.
And probably the last question we've got time for, although Kathy's kindly said she'll answer one she hasn't got around to, and we'll in written form, and we'll put them on our website. What are the next steps, and how can you transfer what you have developed into the work of more farms?
So I think the main thing for us is to actually share what we've learned with the other farmers in the area. And we're really lucky, especially in one of the catchments, there's an active farmer cluster working, and they that's led by Kent Wildlife Trust. And so it gives us a network to basically allow some peer-to-peer learning, even though I guess it's not completely peer-to-peer, because we are providing some of that guidance on it. But a lot of it, I think, is about just being quite open about what we've done and what we've asking people forward with. Are really keen to try out lots of different things, and the less they're happy to take on suggestions, but also the less prescriptive we can be, the more interesting it'll get. So opening that up, and I mean, I always think of it, because I just really like maps, getting a big map out and asking them to draw on it what they would be interested in doing on their own land, and then talking around the things that we've learned, and that the learning that's come out through project like the NFM research project and other projects that are ongoing at the moment. There's so much knowledge out there already. I think a lot of it is just about bringing people together to allow them to really learn from each other and see how that could be applicable to the land. And I think that's where the local evidence is really useful in showing what we've actually delivered here and there, and where people can go out and visit those farms. So that's the next steps for us, trying to work out how to practically do that while technically probably not being able to hold any workshops or farm walks for quite a while.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I'm afraid we've run out of time now. So thanks very much to Kathy for such a lively and thorough presentation. And thanks to everyone for joining. If you do have feedback and follow-up questions, please do email us there, and there's some contact details on the screen. The recording of the webinar will be available. If you'd like to listen again, or colleagues couldn't make it, please let them know about that. As are all the recordings from our previous webinars, where you can also see our full program, which runs up to the end of next year. So there's a lot of variety. And our next webinar is on the 19th of November, and Dr. Tom Nesbitt from Forest Research and part of the research program working on the Landwise project will be talking about woodlands and natural flood management. And we have a newsletter as well, so you can sign up again on our website, and if you do, we'll let you know about upcoming webinars. And we won't be bombarding your mailbox, but we will be in touch now and again to let you know about important stuff. So just remains to say thanks once again to Kathy. Excellent, really lively, interesting presentation, and hopefully we'll see you all again on the next webinar. Thanks again. Bye.
Thanks a lot, Gerard.